Addiction is rarely a chase for pleasure. It is far more often an escape from something that feels unbearable to face. What looks like indulgence on the surface is, at a deeper level, an attempt to soothe a nervous system that has been overwhelmed, an effort to quiet a mind that never learned how to feel safe in its own silence. The substance, the behavior, the pattern, these are not the true desires. They are responses. They are adaptations. They are the body's desperate language when words were never enough or never allowed. No one wakes up one day and consciously decides to destroy their own life for the sake of enjoyment. That narrative is convenient, but it is profoundly incomplete. Because when you look closely, really look, you begin to see that addiction doesn't begin with pleasure. It begins with discomfort, with unease, with a subtle or overwhelming sense that something inside is not okay. And when that feeling has no safe outlet, when there is no space to express it, no presence to witness it, the mind searches for relief in whatever form it can find. What we call addiction is often the most reliable form of relief a person has ever experienced. Not the healthiest, not the safest, but the most consistent. It works, at least temporarily. It numbs the anxiety, softens the grief, quiets the shame, dulls the loneliness. And when something works that effectively, especially for someone who has never known another way to cope, it becomes less of a choice and more of a necessity in their internal world. The question then shifts. It is no longer why the addiction, but why the pain? Because the pain came first, the discomfort came first, the sense of disconnection came first, and the addiction followed as a solution, not a problem. A flawed solution, yes, but a solution nonetheless. And until we are willing to understand what it is solving, we will continue to misunderstand the person who relies on it. There is often a history beneath addiction that is not immediately visible. Not always dramatic or obvious, but deeply impactful. Experiences of not being seen, not being heard, not being held in a way that allowed the nervous system to relax. Moments where emotions had to be suppressed to maintain connection or safety. Situations where vulnerability was met with dismissal, or worse, rejection. Over time, these experiences teach the body that certain feelings are dangerous, that certain parts of the self must be hidden or silenced. And when those parts have nowhere to go, they do not disappear. They accumulate, they intensify, they seek expression. Addiction becomes one of the few ways they can be released, even if only temporarily. It becomes a private refuge in a world that has not felt safe enough to fully inhabit. This is why simply removing the addictive behavior without addressing the underlying pain often leads to relapse or replacement. Because the need has not disappeared, the pain has not been resolved, the nervous system is still searching for relief. And if one avenue is closed, another will emerge. Not because the person lacks discipline, but because the body is still trying to survive in the only way it knows how. There is a profound misunderstanding in the way society frames addiction. It is often seen as a moral failure, a lack of character, a weakness that needs to be corrected through willpower or punishment. But this perspective ignores the fundamental reality that addiction is, at its core, an attempt to regulate internal distress. It is not a failure of morality. It is a response to suffering. And when we approach it with judgment, we reinforce the very conditions that sustain it. Shame deepens, isolation increases, the internal pain intensifies, and the need for relief becomes even more urgent. The cycle tightens not because the person refuses to change, but because the environment around them does not support the kind of healing that is actually required. Real change does not come from condemnation. It comes from understanding. It comes from creating spaces where a person can safely explore what they are trying to escape from, where they can begin to feel what was previously unbearable without being overwhelmed. It requires patience, compassion, and a willingness to look beyond the behavior and into the experience that drives it. Because when a person finally feels seen in their pain, something begins to shift. The need for escape softens. The intensity of the internal pressure decreases. The reliance on the addictive behavior starts to loosen, not because it was forcibly removed, but because it is no longer the only available option for relief. Pleasure may be part of the experience of addiction, but it is rarely the reason it persists. The real driver is the absence of peace, the lack of safety within one's own body, the unresolved emotions that continue to surface without a place to land. And until those elements are addressed, the behavior itself will continue to make sense, even if it appears destructive from the outside. To truly understand addiction, you have to be willing to sit with this discomforting truth, that what looks like self-destruction is often an act of self-preservation, that the person is not choosing the addiction as much as they are choosing the only relief they know, and that beneath every addictive pattern is a human being who is trying, in the best way they can, to survive something that has never been fully acknowledged or healed. When you begin to see it this way, the conversation changes. The question is no longer about blame, it is about care, it is about curiosity. It is about asking what happened, not what is wrong. And in that shift, something profoundly human is restored. The recognition that even in the most destructive behaviors, there is a logic, there is a history, there is a need that has yet to be met. What if everything you've been told about addiction being a failure of willpower is not only incomplete, but deeply misleading? What if the real story has nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with wounds that were never given the chance to heal? Because when you look beneath the surface of any addictive behavior, you don't find a person who simply lacks discipline. You find a history, often quiet, often invisible, but profoundly influential. Trauma does not always arrive as a single catastrophic event. It can be subtle, cumulative, woven into everyday experiences where a child learns that their emotions are too much, their needs are inconvenient, or their authentic self is somehow unacceptable. It can live in the absence of what should have been there. A lack of safety, a lack of attunement, a lack of being truly seen. And when these experiences occur repeatedly, especially in early life, they shape the very architecture of the brain and the nervous system. The body learns quickly. It learns what is safe to feel and what must be suppressed. It learns how to stay connected to others, even if that means disconnecting from itself. It learns to prioritize survival over authenticity. And these adaptations, while necessary at the time, do not simply disappear when the environment changes. They remain embedded in the nervous system, influencing how a person experiences the world long after the original circumstances have passed. This is where addiction begins to make sense, not as a failure, but as a continuation of those early survival strategies. When a person carries unresolved trauma, their internal world can feel overwhelming. Emotions may arise with an intensity that feels unmanageable. Thoughts may loop in patterns that offer no relief. The body may exist in a constant state of tension or numbness, and without tools to process these experiences, the system looks for external ways to regulate what it cannot handle internally. Substances and addictive behaviors offer a kind of immediate regulation. They alter brain chemistry in ways that can temporarily soothe anxiety, dull emotional pain, or create a sense of control where there was none. For someone whose nervous system has been shaped by trauma, this relief is not trivial. It can feel essential. It can feel like the only way to return to a state that resembles calm, even if only briefly. To call this a lack of willpower is to ignore the complexity of what is happening beneath the surface. Willpower operates within the realm of conscious choice, but trauma operates at a much deeper level. It influences automatic responses, emotional reactivity, and physiological states that are not easily overridden by intention alone. When a person reaches for an addictive substance or behavior, it is often not a calculated decision. It is a conditioned response, a reflex shaped by years of unmet needs and unprocessed experiences. There is also a profound element of disconnection that accompanies unresolved trauma, a disconnection from one's own body, from one's emotions, from a stable sense of self. This disconnection can create a persistent feeling of emptiness or restlessness, a sense that something is missing but cannot be clearly identified. Addiction steps in to fill that void, to create a temporary sense of wholeness, even if it is artificial and fleeting. And yet, the very thing that provides relief also perpetuates the cycle, because while the addiction soothes the symptoms, it does not address the underlying trauma. The pain remains, often intensifying over time as the consequences of the addiction begin to accumulate. Shame deepens, relationships strain or break, opportunities are lost, and each of these outcomes adds another layer to the original wound, reinforcing the need for escape. This is why approaches that focus solely on stopping the behavior often fall short. They address the visible aspect of the problem without engaging with its root. It is like cutting the leaves off a plant while leaving the roots intact. The behavior may pause for a time, but the conditions that gave rise to it are still present, waiting for an opportunity to express themselves again. Healing requires a different approach. It requires a willingness to turn toward the pain rather than away from it, to create environments where it is safe to feel what was once unbearable. It involves rebuilding a connection with the self, learning to recognize and tolerate emotions without being overwhelmed, developing new ways of regulating the nervous system that do not rely on external substances or compulsive behaviors. This process is not quick and it is not easy. It demands patience, support, and a level of compassion that many people have never received, let alone learn to offer themselves. But it is in this space that true change becomes possible. Not through force, not through shame, but through understanding. Because when a person begins to understand the origins of their behavior, something shifts. The narrative changes from what is wrong with me to what happened to me. And in that shift, there is a softening, a reduction in self-judgment, an opening that allows for healing to begin. The addiction is no longer seen as an enemy to be defeated, but as a signal, a message pointing towards something that needs attention and care. Weak willpower suggests that the solution lies in trying harder, in exerting more control. But unresolved trauma reveals that the solution lies in something entirely different, in creating safety, in fostering connection, in addressing the wounds that have been carried, often silently, for years. It is not about pushing through the pain, but about understanding it, integrating it, and ultimately transforming the relationship to it. When you see addiction through this lens, the person struggling with it is no longer reduced to their behavior. They are recognized as someone who adapted to circumstances that were too much to bear, someone who found a way to cope when no better options were available. And while those coping mechanisms may no longer serve them, they deserve to be understood in the context in which they were formed. This perspective does not remove responsibility, but it reframes it. Responsibility becomes less about blame and more about the opportunity to engage in the work of healing, to seek out the support and resources needed to address the underlying trauma, to gradually build a life that no longer requires escape as a primary means of survival. Because at its core, addiction is not a story of weakness. It is a story of adaptation in the face of pain, a story of a nervous system doing its best to cope with experiences that were never fully processed. And until those experiences are acknowledged and addressed, the behavior will continue to make sense, even as it causes harm. To truly support someone in overcoming addiction, you must be willing to look beyond the surface, to see the layers beneath, to recognize that what appears as a lack of willpower is often the echo of unresolved trauma that is still seeking resolution, still asking to be seen, still waiting for the kind of attention and care that was missing when it mattered most. The idea that addiction is simply a matter of choice sounds convincing until you look closely at when and how choice actually becomes available to a human being. Because choice is not just the ability to say yes or no in a given moment. It is the capacity to pause, to reflect, to feel without being overwhelmed, and to respond rather than react. And for many people caught in addiction, that capacity has been shaped, often limited, by experiences that occurred long before the addictive behavior ever appeared. When the nervous system is under stress, when the body perceives threat even in the absence of immediate danger, the brain does not prioritize thoughtful decision-making. It prioritizes survival. It moves quickly, automatically, pulling from patterns that have worked before, even if those patterns are destructive in the long run. In that state, what looks like a conscious choice is often a conditioned response, something that happens faster than awareness itself. This is why telling someone to just choose differently rarely creates lasting change, because the moment of action is not where the real issue begins. By the time the behavior shows up, the internal process has already been set in motion, emotionally, neurologically, even physically. The craving, the urge, the pull toward relief is not a random event. It is the culmination of a series of internal signals that the person may not yet fully understand or even recognize. Awareness is what begins to interrupt this automatic chain. Not intellectual awareness alone, not simply knowing that a behavior is harmful, but a deeper, embodied awareness. The ability to notice what is happening inside in real time, to feel the tightening in the chest, the restlessness in the body, the surge of anxiety or emptiness that precedes the urge, to recognize the emotional landscape that gives rise to the behavior rather than being immediately swept away by it. But awareness on its own is not enough, because when people begin to see their patterns more clearly, they often also encounter the pain that those patterns were protecting them from. And if that pain is met with harshness, with self-criticism, with judgment, the system will instinctively retreat back into the familiar escape of the addiction. Compassion becomes essential at this point, not as a soft or indulgent response, but as a stabilizing force that allows a person to stay present with their experience without being overwhelmed by it. Compassion creates space. It tells the nervous system that it is safe enough to remain here, safe enough to feel, safe enough to explore what is happening without immediately needing to shut it down. It shifts the internal dialogue from accusation to curiosity, from "why am I like this?" to "what is this trying to show me?" And in that shift, something profound begins to happen. The person is no longer at war with themselves. It is within this space of awareness and compassion that real choice begins to emerge. Not as a forced act of willpower, not as a rigid attempt to control behavior, but as a natural outcome of increased understanding and reduced internal pressure. When a person can see their urge clearly and meet it with kindness rather than fear or shame, the urgency of the behavior often begins to soften. The gap between impulse and action widens, even if only slightly at first. That gap is where choice lives. It is subtle, it is fragile in the beginning, but it is real. And with time, with practice, with continued support, it can grow stronger. The person begins to realize that they are not completely at the mercy of their impulses, that there are moments, however brief, where a different response is possible. This does not mean the urges disappear overnight. It does not mean the path becomes easy. There will still be moments of struggle, moments where the old patterns take over, moments where the pull toward relief feels stronger than the emerging capacity for awareness. But even in those moments, something has changed. The person is no longer entirely unconscious of what is happening. There is a witnessing presence, however faint, that begins to develop over time, and that presence is transformative, because it allows for learning rather than repetition. Each time a person becomes aware of their pattern, even if they still act on it, they are gathering information. They are beginning to map the internal terrain of their experience. They are becoming more familiar with the conditions that trigger their behavior, the emotions that fuel it, the thoughts that justify it. With compassion, this learning process becomes sustainable. Without it, awareness can easily turn into another source of shame, another reason to feel inadequate or broken. But when awareness is paired with kindness, it becomes a tool for growth rather than self-punishment. It becomes a way of gently guiding oneself toward new possibilities rather than forcing change through fear. Choice in this context is not a single decisive moment. It is a gradual unfolding. It is the accumulation of small moments where awareness interrupts automaticity, where compassion softens reactivity, where a different response becomes possible, even if only for a second. Over time, those seconds can extend into minutes, those minutes into sustained patterns, until what once felt impossible begins to feel accessible. This reframing challenges a deeply ingrained belief that people struggling with addiction simply need to try harder, to be stronger, to exercise more control. It reveals instead that what they often need is support in developing awareness, in cultivating compassion, in creating the internal and external conditions where choice can actually arise. Because without those conditions, the idea of choice remains abstract, disconnected from the lived reality of someone whose nervous system is overwhelmed, whose emotional world feels unmanageable, whose patterns have been reinforced over years or even decades. But with awareness and compassion, choice becomes tangible. It becomes something that can be experienced, practiced, and gradually strengthened. And perhaps most importantly, this perspective restores a sense of dignity to the person in the process. They are no longer seen as someone who repeatedly fails to make the right choices, but as someone who is learning, step by step, to reclaim a capacity that was shaped by forces beyond their control. Someone who is not broken, but in the process of understanding themselves more deeply than they ever have before. In that understanding, in that gentle, persistent return to awareness and compassion, the possibility of change becomes not just an idea, but a lived experience. One moment at a time, one breath at a time, one choice at a time. Addiction does not grow in a vacuum. It grows in disconnection. Disconnection from self, from others, from a sense of belonging, from a feeling of being seen and accepted as you are. And when a human being lives in that kind of isolation, whether visible or hidden, the pain of it becomes almost unbearable. Not always loud, not always obvious, but persistent, like a quiet ache that never fully leaves. Addiction steps into that space not as a random enemy, but as a substitute, a temporary bridge over a gap that was never meant to exist. What many people misunderstand is that the opposite of addiction is not simply sobriety, it is connection. Because when someone feels truly connected to themselves, to another person, to a community, the need to escape begins to lose its urgency. The internal pressure softens, the sense of aloneness begins to dissolve, and with that, the behavior that once felt necessary starts to loosen its grip. Judgment, on the other hand, deepens the very wound that addiction is trying to soothe. When a person is met with criticism, with blame, with rejection, it reinforces the belief that they are fundamentally flawed, that they are not worthy of understanding or care. And this belief does not inspire change, it fuels the cycle. Because the more a person feels ashamed, the more they seek relief from that shame. And the most familiar, most immediate form of relief is often the very behavior that others are condemning. Shame isolates. It pushes people further into themselves, into secrecy, into silence. It convinces them that they must hide the very parts of themselves that need the most attention and care. And in that hiding, the addiction thrives. Not because the person wants to remain stuck, but because the environment around them does not feel safe enough for them to step out of it. Connection requires something radically different. It requires presence without agenda, listening without interruption, understanding without immediate correction. It asks us to look beyond the behavior and see the human being underneath it, to recognize that what we are witnessing is not just a set of actions, but a story, one that often includes pain, loss, confusion, and unmet needs. This does not mean ignoring the consequences of addiction or pretending that the behavior is harmless. It means approaching it with a level of humanity that allows for both truth and compassion to coexist. It means holding the person accountable in a way that does not strip them of their dignity, that does not reduce them to their struggles, that does not close the door on the possibility of change. When someone feels genuinely seen, something begins to shift internally. The defensive walls start to lower. The need to protect oneself through avoidance or denial begins to soften. There is a subtle but powerful movement from resistance to openness. And in that openness, new possibilities can emerge. Possibilities that were previously inaccessible in a state of isolation. Connection also restores a sense of identity that addiction often erodes. When a person is trapped in a cycle of compulsive behavior, they can begin to see themselves only through that lens. They become the addict, the problem, the disappointment. These labels carry weight. They shape how a person views themselves and how they believe others see them. And over time, they can become self-fulfilling, reinforcing the very patterns they describe. But when connection is present, when someone is treated as more than their behavior, it disrupts that narrative. It reminds them that they are not defined by their struggles, that there are other parts of them that are still intact, still valuable, still worthy of recognition. This shift in identity is not superficial. It is foundational, because a person who begins to see themselves differently will gradually begin to act differently. There is also a physiological aspect to connection that cannot be overlooked. Human beings are wired for relationship. Our nervous systems respond to the presence of others in ways that directly influence our sense of safety and regulation. A calm, compassionate presence can help settle an agitated system. A genuine moment of understanding can reduce stress responses that might otherwise trigger the urge to escape. These are not abstract concepts. They are measurable, embodied experiences. When connection is consistent, it creates a new internal reference point. The person begins to learn, often for the first time, that it is possible to experience discomfort without being overwhelmed, to feel emotions without needing to numb them, to exist in their own body without immediately seeking an exit. This learning does not happen through instruction alone. It happens through experience, through repeated moments of safe, supportive interaction. Judgment interrupts this process. It activates the very stress responses that connection is meant to soothe. It signals danger, not safety. It tells the nervous system that it must remain on guard, that it cannot relax, that it must continue to rely on familiar coping mechanisms to manage the internal chaos. In this state, growth is not impossible, but it is significantly hindered. This is why environments that prioritize empathy, understanding, and relational support tend to be more effective in supporting recovery than those that rely solely on punishment or control. because they address the underlying need for connection rather than focusing exclusively on the behavior itself. They create conditions where healing can occur, where the person is not just told to change, but supported in the process of changing. Healing through connection does not mean the absence of boundaries. In fact, healthy boundaries are an essential part of meaningful connection. They provide structure, clarity, and a sense of mutual respect. But boundaries rooted in care are fundamentally different from those rooted in judgment. They communicate, "I see you, I care about you, and I will not enable behavior that harms you or others," rather than, "You are the problem, and you need to be fixed." Over time, as connection deepens, the reliance on addictive behavior often begins to diminish. Not because it has been forcibly removed, but because it is no longer serving the same purpose. The person has access to other forms of relief, other ways of regulating their internal experience, other sources of meaning and fulfillment. The gap that addiction once filled is no longer empty. This transformation is not instantaneous. It unfolds gradually, through repeated experiences of being met with understanding rather than rejection, through moments of vulnerability that are received with care rather than criticism, through the slow rebuilding of trust in others and in oneself. And while the path may include setbacks, those setbacks are no longer met with the same level of shame. They become part of the process, opportunities for learning rather than reasons for giving up. To say that healing addiction requires connection is not a sentimental statement. It is a recognition of a fundamental human need. It acknowledges that at the core of many addictive patterns is a longing to be seen, to be understood, to belong. And when that longing is met in a genuine and sustained way, the need to seek relief through harmful behaviors begins to lose its intensity. Judgment may feel like a quick response, a way of asserting control or expressing frustration, but it does not create the conditions for lasting change. Connection does. And in choosing connection, in offering presence instead of condemnation, we participate in a process that not only supports recovery, but restores something deeper, the sense that even in the midst of struggle, a person is not alone, not beyond reach, not beyond care.